In this video, I'm going to discuss the concept of spoken genres. The references that I'm going to use include these two: Go and Burns, Spoken Discourse in Genres of Speaking, and Joyce and Slate. Now, I should say that I'm not recording this video in a studio, so please expect some different kinds of background noise here. Okay, so let's get started with this idea and see what we have on the menu today. I'm going to discuss spoken discourse and genre of speaking, including these four categories: features of spoken discourse, the concept of genre and text type, genres of speaking, and the contribution of corpus linguistics. Probably some of these will have to be done in a separate video. And then the nature of casual conversation will be expanded on, and I will try to touch on some of the implications for teaching. I'll discuss the types and structure of spoken interactions, teaching structure, and teaching the micro features of casual conversations. So the topics are not going to be presented in exactly the same order here, and some of these subcategories will be lumped together and they will be spoken about under the same category. So let's start with features of spoken discourse. There is a large amount of literature on written discourse, but I'm afraid when it comes to spoken discourse, we don't find as much literature, although there is some. So the analysis of spoken discourse and what we're going to cover in this video and perhaps the next video is based on a few fields. It's informed by discourse analysis, by conversation analysis, speech act theory, etc. Discourse analysis is one of the important contributions here. It's because that it looks at conversations and spoken genres from a sociological and sociolinguistic perspectives. There are four concepts which I would like to elaborate on, including adjacency pairs, turn-taking, topic and interaction management, and discourse strategies. These are important because they constitute the features of analysis techniques in spoken genre analysis. One of them is, the first one is adjacency pairs, which comes from conversation analysis, or CA, and it refers to pairs that we often use in conversations, including questions and answers, offering and accepting, instructing and receiving, greeting and greeting back, and request as well as grant. To give you an example of an adjacency pair is when you make a request and then your request is granted. The opposite will be when you make a request. For example, can I have a cup of tea, please? That's a request. But it's not granted, it's declined. For example, no, I'm sorry, we have run out of coffee, something like that. From this perspective, you can divide adjacency pairs into preferred and dispreferred. Preferred is when the answer, like the grant, is positive, but dispreferred is when there is a rejection, like the decline of the request. The second type of analysis techniques is referred to as turn-taking, and I have discussed this in the spoken and interactional competence analysis. I think that would be a good idea for you to go back to those videos which I created a while back and take a look. I'll try to leave the links to them in the comments section. So turn-taking is a technique in which interlocutors recognize points when to take the next turn. In our first languages, we learn this naturally, and it's one of the things that we acquire. However, in a second language that we are learning, there might be slightly different or significantly different rules for turn-taking. It depends on the language that you're teaching. I don't expect that all languages would have exactly the same turn-taking rules. There might be differences, and at the same time, there also may be some universals. So, the first concept that we learn here is the concept of turn constructional units. It's because we want to analyze the spoken genre. And when we look at the turns, we need to have some kind of gauge, some kind of measure to understand when and how turns may take place. Turn constructional unit is a very useful one. It was first proposed by Sachs and colleagues in 1974 in a paper, and it refers to a fundamental segment of speech in a conversation. For example, look at this little box here. There are two phrases here, or two chunks. One is well, pretty strange. Well is one TCU, and it's a lexical one because it's just one word. So that's the first type of TCU, lexical. The second one is also a TCU because that's when the phrase finishes or ends, and this is exactly when the other interlocutor can chime in right after pretty strange. When I say, well, pretty strange, there are two very narrow pauses there. And those short pauses are potential opportunities for the other interlocutor to chime in and take his or her turn to speak. So some of the TCUs are lexical, some are phrasal, like pretty strange, and some are clausal, when there is a longer chunk of discourse, which is made of a subject and a verb and perhaps some complements. And finally, the end of TCU can be regarded as, or can be marked as, what we call a transition relevance place, or TPR or TRP. A TRP is a juncture at which the turn at talk could pass from one person to another person. So if the end of the TCU right here during the pause it means that someone else, another interlocutor, started to talk, that's the turn was passed to that person, then that end, that small juncture, serves as a TRP. So most often we know in our first languages what a TCU is, and of course if you have spoken the second language and if you have been exposed to it for a long enough amount of time, you can also identify those TCUs and use them in order to chime in and take the floor. The other concept which is closely related to turn taking is topic and interaction management. I have also discussed this in a previous video. It refers to those management techniques that we use to initiate, to develop, to change, or to end topics. Now, in order to do any of these, that's to initiate, to develop, etc., we need to learn a few different types of functions. In our first languages, we know them. Let's say we're learning, let's say Chinese, like Mandarin as a second language. Then I think that's very helpful or necessary for teachers to teach us as students how to do summarizing, how to do clarification, or how to elaborate on concepts, how to provide feedback, how to make requests, etc. Another concept which is closely related to topic and interaction management is discourse strategies. For example, some strategies would include how to open conversations, how to open a piece of discourse, or how to close it, how to continue it, etc. One of the strategies that is very useful, and it actually has to do with listenership, good listenership, is back-channeling. And it happens when a participant interjects responses to the speaker. For example, when we express disagreement or we express interest, it could be using a word or just some interjections like, oh, wow, things like that. Or we express happiness, excitement, etc. That's really, all of them actually count as back-channeling. Now, if you have access to Go and Burns books, I would suggest that you go through pages 106, 109, and 112 to look at a few boxes there. There are some examples and some questions and activities for you. I think they will be really useful to take a look and to think about. They will allow you to practice these concepts and also put them into some context. Now, let's move on to the concept of genre and text type. Now I'm looking at genre from a macro perspective. Previously, in the previous slide, I looked at genre from a micro perspective, from the perspective of moves. Now, from a macro perspective. And that's the global structure of, for example, spoken interactions. One of the definitions for genre, which was proposed by Fairclough in 1995, is a socially ratified way of using language in connection with a particular type of social activity. I like this definition because it's really comprehensive and pretty easy to understand. So from this perspective, genres are pieces of goal-oriented spoken in language. They could also be written, but since our focus is on spoken interactions, we just stick with that. Now, in this framework that was proposed by Burns, Joyce, and Gollin in 1996, which you can still find in many books, which has been reproduced in different ways, spoken interactions has been divided into conversations and encounters. So they basically indicate two types of functional motivation. Encounters function as interactional or pragmatic, and conversations function as this is transactional. Encounters function as transactional or pragmatic, and conversations function as interactional or interpersonal. Now, I should also add that it's very difficult to find a pure encounter in which there is no interpersonal or interactional exchanges. And on the other hand, it's also pretty difficult to find a pure conversation where there is no transaction. But you could look at them as some kind of suggested taxonomy or suggested way of looking at spoken interactions, keeping in mind that there might be overlaps. Transactional or pragmatic function refers to exchanging goods or exchanging services. An example would be when you go to a coffee shop when you're ordering something, for example, a cup of tea. The sort of conversation that's happening between you and the shopkeeper or the waiter in that context is mostly transactional, if not 100%. On the other hand, there are circumstances in which you exchange factual information. For example, let's say you meet a person at a conference on some topics in linguistics, and you start to exchange information about a topic of your interest. It's purely just giving and receiving information about some topic. You may disagree or agree with them, or you may raise questions and those kind of things. That's what we refer to as factual or informational transactions, which serve the purpose of pragmatic functions. On the other hand, we have conversations which are interactional or interpersonal and can be divided into two types: formal conversations and casual conversations. A formal conversation happens between two people with unequal power, for example, a professor and a student. On the other hand, it could be friendly, but the sense of inequality in power is there. On the other hand, there is casual or a conversation with equal power, for example, between you and a member of your family, or between you and a colleague. Now, sometimes these casual conversations are quite polite, and some of them are confirming. The fact that one of them is confirming, the other one is polite, doesn't mean that confirming one is impolite or is rude. It's just basically really a kind of jargon that is used to differentiate between two strands or two types of casual conversations. Polite ones take place between, for example, strangers. When there is no contact, there has never been any contact before the interlocutors before. So that's why we call it minus contact. For example, you start a small talk with someone at a bus stop. You have never seen that person before. You have no emotional or psychological connections with that person. Therefore, that's also minus affect. So casual, polite conversation, which is negative, and a negative contact, negative affect could be a casual, polite conversation between you and a stranger. On the other hand, you can start a confirming casual conversation with someone that you know, for example, a colleague or a member of your family, a spouse or someone. This means that you know that person, therefore there is some history to your conversation, therefore that's plus contact. And in addition, you have psychological and emotional connection with that person, and depending on who that person is, therefore it's plus affect. So the sort of language that you would use for this type, confirming, would be probably different from this type, or polite. Now, an activity that you might want to do if you like to practice understanding these concepts further is that you can synthesize this framework with the 3 types of metacognitive knowledge that were previously discussed in another video. The 3 types being task, people, and the concept of strategies. The synthesis will allow you to connect dots which are otherwise not connected. I think that's something that I highly recommend. Now, the other slide is also more or less the same thing, which I presented, but has been presented in a different visual way, and it's by Joyce and Gollin, 2 of the same scholars who presented the previous framework. What I would like to add here and finish this video is the concept of chunk and the concept of chat. Whereas chunks have identifiable generic structures like conversations, casuals, and informal conversations, chats have no global structure, and therefore, in order to find out how chats progress from one topic to another or progress from one interlocutor to another, we need to do a move by move kind of analysis. And if you're asking what is a move, I would say it's a discoursal segment that performs a particular communicative function. So let me just stop this video at this point because it's getting quite long. I'll continue talking about spoken genres in the next video by discussing storytelling. Thank you very much for your attention.